Good evening, everybody. Thank you all for coming, and thank you to the organisers of PHP Northwest for accepting my request. Sorry, Northeast. Sorry. I know. Thank you for the organisers for accepting my request to come and talk to you tonight. My name's Stuart. I'm here to talk about event sourcing and what happens when it meets GDPR. And dongles. Come on, there we go. Right, I've been in the industry 25 years. I've worked in academia, I've worked in startups, I've worked in big enterprise, including multinationals, and I've worked in government and related projects as well. And I've done most roles from CTO downwards during this last career. So I haven't seen everything by any means, but I have seen a lot. These days I run my own business, Gdpr Digital. You can, the handle there at the bottom, you can follow us on Twitter if you want. You're very welcome to follow me on Twitter as well. However, please be warned, I'm passionate about my causes, I'm passionate about my hobbies, and I tweet a lot about both. So if you're the kind of person who only wants to see tech, you'd be happier following the company. Okay, so let's start with a show of hands. How many of you already use event sourcing? Nobody. Okay, I did not anticipate that. How many of you are thinking of adopting event sourcing at some point in the future? About 4 or 5 people, maybe? Okay. Well, hopefully you're going to find this talk then very helpful. And the last question, again, show of hands. How many of you already work in a regulated industry? Okay, quite a few. Hopefully by the end of this talk, I'll have convinced you that you all now work in a regulated industry. But we'll see. So the talk's divided into 4 sections. I'm going to give you an introduction to what event sourcing is, or my understanding of it anyway. And then I'm going to do the same for GDPR. We're then going to spend some time looking at how the two interact with each other. And I've got some advice at the end for you to take away if you're thinking of adopting event sourcing. Now, please do ask questions as we go. There's a lot to get through, so I apologize if I'm going at quite a pace. The more questions you ask, the more you'll get out of tonight, I promise. So let's start with event sourcing. Anyone want to offer a description of what you think event sourcing is? Anybody? Nope. Okay. Primarily, it's a data architecture. And it's a data architecture where state changes are represented by something called an event. Now, all an event is, it's a record of something that has already happened. That's all an event is. It can be any structure you want. Doesn't matter. And during the research for this talk, I went into the documentation of a popular event sourcing framework. And I lifted some examples from it to show you what events could look like. If you imagine an e-commerce shopping cart, kind of thing many of us will have implemented during our careers. This is the kind of thing you'd use to describe it in events terms. Now, what's going on architecturally? That's my interest as an architect, primarily. We've got an actor of some kind. They may be interacting with a user interface. Could be an app, could be a website, could be both. They may be interacting with an API. It doesn't really matter. Behind all of that, ultimately, is your business model and your data model. Now, I don't know about you, but I was taught to draw diagrams exactly that kind of structure back in the mid-90s. And I was taught by people who'd been doing it since the 70s. There's nothing new there so far. And if we extend that diagram to add the database in a traditional system actually holds current state. Now, with current state, you've taken your inputs, you've fed those into operations, and out comes new states that you then save in the database. That's what current state is. So the database is like keeping a running score of your current results. But it doesn't keep your workings out. It doesn't know how you got there. So architecturally, you just have that. And depending on how you deploy it, that is sometimes described as a 3-tier architecture. Okay? So there's nothing magical there at all. Now, this is where event sourcing comes in and where it's different. You're not storing state in the database with event sourcing. You store the events themselves. So again, architecturally, we're interacting with something known as an event store. 2 words. Event store, 1 word, I believe, is a registered trademark. So it's 2 words. Now, here's the thing. Because you're not storing current state anywhere, you've got to build it when you want it. You've got to calculate it. And that's a process called playback, which you'll find various frameworks talk about. And again, architecturally, we've got our business model and our data model, and they're primarily concerned with 2 activities. You've got event validation. It's looking at incoming events to preserve the integrity of the event store. And then you've got event playback, which is calculating current state for whatever's sat in front of it to interact with your actors. That's quite a bit different to certainly how I've built systems for 25 years. And I imagine it's quite different to how you currently build systems. Yeah? You say so? So, when I ask people who are advocates of event sourcing, why do this? What's the point of it? Normally somewhere in the argument is a statement similar to this. Because you've got a whole history of how you got to where you are, you can go back in time. You've effectively created a time machine, in theory. Thing is, though, does that hold up to scrutiny? We're going to come back to that throughout this talk. That guarantee is the whole point of doing event sourcing, but does it actually work? I want to keep focused on the event store for the moment. See, architecturally, our event store has replaced a database in our architecture. We used to have a database there, and now we've got an event store instead. But you see, it's still a database. It doesn't matter whether it's being sat on top of MySQL or Postgres, if it's sat on top of some sort of NoSQL data store, or even something that's specially written for event sourcing. It doesn't matter. It's ultimately still a database. It's ultimately still dealing with persisting data and retrieving data based on queries. You can't get around that. There's no magic can get around that. And the reason I mention that is because the event store, therefore, is subject to all the constraints any other database system ever invented are. Things like the amount of available IOPS in production. It's amazing how many people overlook that one. Then, in a production system, you'd normally stick your database on a different server. So that means you've got a network involved, and you've got constraints that the network imposes. No database server scales linearly. The more work you're doing at once, the more performance is affected. And event stores have the same problem. And because you're dealing with persistent data, your event store is your primary database at the end of the day. That means you've got all the maintenance operations of backups and restores to deal with, and also things like schema changes, ultimately. Now, the folks who are advocates for event sourcing went, well, there is actually a kind of database out there that sort of suits our way of working and minimizes a lot of those performance problems. And they're known as append-only databases or log databases. So it's quite common to see event sourcing packaged with one of these as the event store. Sometimes, not always, but sometimes, these kind of databases are immutable. Once data's in, it's in there forever. You can't get it back out, and you can't edit the data that's in there. And given we're talking about GDPR, that's a topic we're going to come back to several times throughout the night. Now, what I've been describing so far, you could call a pure event sourcing system. If you imagine, when you're working with databases, you're pulling back current state, and you're already finding the database is often a bottleneck, aren't you, in your code? So imagine you're trying to pull back a whole history of events to compute the current state instead. That's an even bigger bottleneck. So in reality, on real systems, event playback is just too slow to use all the time. And that's where something called ES-CQRS comes in. Anyone heard of that? Nope? One or two nods? CQRS itself, let's deal with CQRS first. It stands for Command Query Responsibility Separation, or segregation if you prefer. I've seen it written both ways. Okay? Now, I mentioned that event sourcing is a data architecture. CQRS actually started out as a code architecture, nothing to do with data by itself. This is where it came from. And the idea is your code is separated out. Your read operations is a distinct path of code to your write operations. And by distinct path of code, ultimately we're talking about separate business models, not necessarily separate data models. And here's a diagram taken from Martin Fowler's website. You all know of Martin Fowler? Okay. If you don't, and you're involved in any sort of software design, martinfowler.com is a resource you need to bookmark. He's been writing about software architectures and patterns, Christ, how many years now? I think it goes back to at least 2000. It's a very, very influential website. But here's a diagram I've taken directly from Martin's site showing where CQRS came from. Apologies about the purple, that's his diagram, not mine, I promise. Now, the thing is with CQRS is it can also be a data architecture, which is where it gets a bit more interesting. If you've got separate paths through the code, it's very easy to make your read operations read from one database, but your write's going to a different one. And I'm sure some of you have actually split up your database to help scale things in the past. Yeah, that's a very common trick. That doesn't make it a data architecture. What makes it a data architecture is if those databases start to have different schemas. You're storing completely different data in those databases. You're optimizing one database for reads. How many of you have done like reports and stuff against databases? Yeah? So those of you who are nodding, you've probably ended up running reports against databases optimized for that in order to get them through as your systems have scaled. Similar idea, but the actual app itself running off that. And it's that data architecture where the event sourcing crowd get interested. And indeed, that's what ESCQRS is. Because not only is event sourcing a data architecture, so is ESCQRS. It's also a data architecture. And it's designed to solve this problem. A pure system, playing back the events takes too long. So you've got a website that's slow, and what are one of the tricks you use to speed it up? You cache the pages, don't you? You start build caches in. Well, in ESCQRS, conceptually, what you're doing is caching current state as you go along, so you don't have to recalculate it all the time. So architecturally, instead of our event store on its own, what's happened now is we're still writing to the event store, and then the event playback is calculating the current state and writing to something known as a projection cache. And then it means when you're serving read requests out, you're effectively, and again, this is all conceptual, there's a lot of devil in the detail what I'm skipping over, but conceptually you're effectively doing cache lookups from the projection cache in order to get the current state, so you no longer have to calculate it. So, I mentioned earlier about this guarantee about being able to always calculate state by playing back these events. That is important when it comes to the projection cache. It's called a cache because you may choose to back it up and restore it for pragmatic sake, but ultimately, if it's lost for any reason, or you've got a cache that only holds most recently used items, you can rebuild anything in there by just playing back events again. That's why it's a cache and not a primary data store. Very important property, that. So architecturally, if we lose our projection cache for any reason, it can be recreated. It may not be convenient to recreate it if it goes down at like 9 AM on a morning and you've got a busy day, but technically it's supposed to be possible. However, the reason I'm mentioning this is ultimately you've got code doing these calculations to work out what the current state is before it's saved in the projection cache. And that code changes over time. If you deploy an event sourcing system today, that code in 2 years' time will be different. You'll have fixed bugs. Some of the logic will have changed as the business or organization evolves. It's inevitable. You know, code isn't static at the end of the day. And in this case, what I'm talking about here is the event playback code that's doing these projection calculations. It changes over time. And that's going to be something that's important when we look at GDPR. So this guarantee is starting to look a bit iffy already, okay? Because you need to, if you want to absolutely recreate state at any point in time, you need to use the code that existed for that point in time. And doing my research, I didn't come across any event sourcing frameworks that spoke about this problem and how they solve it. So if you want to go back a week or a month or a year and say this is the data that existed at that point, but you're using today's code, you may get a different result than what you had a year ago. Now, the event sourcing people have actually thought of this, and they've got a concept of a snapshot. So instead of the projection cache just being something like memcache, you write stuff in and it just carries on forever, they've introduced this concept of snapshots where you can say, here's the projection cache at this moment in time, so you don't start back from the beginning when you're running your calculations. They are projections at a point in time. And that's something else that's going to become very important when we look at how this impacts GDPR. So that's event sourcing. And just very quickly to sum all that up, an ES-CQRS system, you've not got any current state in it. You are storing events as the primary source of data. State is built by a process that conceptually is known as playback. It's inevitable that some of these events will hold personal data. Personal data is the classic type of data that GDPR is concerned about, and we'll look at that in more detail in a moment. So in an ES-CQRS system, you've got personal data potentially in 3 different places at any moment in time. It will be in the event store if you're handling personal data at all. It is probably in the projection cache if that data has been used, and therefore it is probably in a snapshot somewhere. So remember those 3. We're going to be coming back to looking at how that affects GDPR in a moment. Event stores may be immutable. Once you've written data to an event store, there may not be a mechanism for you to change that data or even delete it. Projection cache is built by code that changes over time. So if you're rerunning calculations, you may get different results on different days. And we've got snapshots to help us with that, to say at this moment in time, here's the projections that we knew about. So that's event sourcing as a very, very quick conceptual overview. Now, those of you who have been looking at event sourcing at all, how does that fit with your own understanding? Any surprises in there? Any differences? Nope. Okay, well, that's good. So let's start looking at GDPR. There's a few eye rolls already. Hopefully, this is just a refresher and you're all familiar with this material. But just in case, it's the General Data Protection Regulation. Anyone know when it came into law? May 23rd? Ish. Okay, close enough. 25th of May last year it came into law. Okay? So this is not something that's upcoming. This is something that's already on the statute book. And in the UK, the relevant piece of legislation is the Data Protection Act of 2018. You may not have heard much about that. You may mostly have heard about GDPR. But the Data Protection Act is just as important. And I'll show you why as we go along. It doesn't matter where your business is based anywhere in the world. If you're handling personal data of people from the EU, this law applies to you. Especially the people who are watching this on YouTube later on. Now, some of you have worked in a regulated industry, but many of you haven't. And when I was researching this talk, I was trying to think. I couldn't think of any other regulation that applies to everyone in the room like GDPR will. Couldn't think of anything. And my advice to you is get used to it. We've enjoyed 30, 40, best part of 50 years of practically unregulated software development. Those days are coming to an end. And GDPR is only going to be the start of it. There is already more legislation coming down the pipeline, and that will affect us regardless of what happens down in the House of Commons later this month, as the UK is committed to maintaining alignment on these standards. So be aware of that. And of course, many of us, our software will be being used by people from outside the UK. So you can't get away from this stuff. You can't get away from it if you're doing free and open source software either. There is no clause you can put in your license file to say GDPR does not apply. If you're handling personal data, it applies. You need to be aware of that. We have a concept in European law and in British law, you cannot sign away your rights. In America you can, over here you can't. Your rights trump any contract you can convince anyone to sign. So be aware of that. You cannot water down GDPR. If you are involved in open source, anyone heard of web dev law? So maybe saw Heather's talk at Scotland PHP back in October. Well, she's put together some guidance for how open source projects can deal with GDPR and comply with it. And that QR code will take you to her current guidance. Please do go have a read of it. Even if you're not involved in open source, her guidance is very easy to follow and very helpful for all organizations. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to, as a refresher, take you through some of the requirements from GDPR and also that are in the Data Protection Act. Usual caveats to apply. I am not a lawyer. I'm not stood up here pretending to offer you legal advice whatsoever. I want to make that absolutely clear. What I've done is I've lifted this section from the advice that's already online from the ICO website. And hopefully, especially those of you in leadership roles in your organizations, you've got this website already bookmarked. If you haven't, you should be. Now this website discusses GDPR in two terms. Don't worry about snagging the link now. The slides will be online after the talk, so don't worry. It provides 2 points of view for getting your head around GDPR. It talks about the obligations on organizations, which as developers impacts us. And it talks about the rights that GDPR and the Data Protection Act gives us as individuals. Obviously, these two come together to form an intersection. So let's go through the obligations first. This is the headline. And you may not have seen this actually stated in such black and white terms before. If you are holding something that's classified as personal data, and we're going to look at what that is in a moment, you need a lawful basis to hold that data. No ifs, no buts. You require a lawful basis. Without a lawful basis, you cannot hold the data. According to the ICO, that means you need to be able to identify the lawful basis for every single piece of personal data you've got in your systems. You've actually got to be able to point at your data sets as a whole and say, this is personal data, this isn't. You've got to be able to say what is and isn't personal data. You've got to keep track of what you've done with it, what you've used it for. Data processing. The ICO talks about data can only be used in ways that are fair. That's an interesting term, shall we say, especially in these historic times. The explanation talks about making sure data is used in non-discriminatory ways. But go read the advice for a whole section on that. Now, one of the ways you can legally hold data is by asking for someone's consent. That's one way you can do that. It's like the opt-in box, okay, that we're all used to when we sign up for things. It should be opt-in, not opt-out. You have to get explicit consent for what you're going to do with that data. If you haven't got explicit consent because you've come up with something new you want to use existing data for, you've got to go back and ask for more consent. You can't just reuse the data because you've already got it. The guidance is very clear on that. There's a concept, a principle of minimal data. You can only ask for data that you actually need for the processing you're going to do. You can't just ask someone for consent for storing data that you don't need. Again, you've got this principle that you can't sign away your rights as an individual. Okay? So you've got to store the minimum amount of data possible. Which means, of course, if your processing changes and you don't need as much data anymore, you may need to scrub the data you've already got consent to hold, which is something you don't see people talk a lot about. There's a concept here that you're not allowed to hold data that's factually inaccurate. Not all personal data is facts. Some of it is opinion. Some of it is the result of processing, which we'll look at in a moment. If you hold personal data, but it's inaccurate, you are required to correct it, or remove it is another exceptional alternative. You're not allowed to hang on to incorrect data. You can't keep data for any longer than needed. Once your lawful basis has lapsed, you're supposed to get rid of it. And you're supposed to delete it proactively. That's a theme that's going to come back up later on in the talk. Now, they don't just mean a soft delete here. You've got to scrub this stuff from everywhere. The ICO website explicitly mentions backups and archives. Okay, you can't hang on to it on a backup tape somewhere. If you've been told to delete it, you've got to get rid of it from everywhere. That also, although the ICO website doesn't talk about it, means you've got to get rid of it from your staging environments and from your dev environments as well. Be aware of that. You can't keep a copy of it anywhere if you've been told to get rid of it. Now, you may be passing this data on to third parties. That's lawful under certain circumstances. Any data you delete, you've got to tell those third parties that you've deleted it, because that may mean their lawful basis for holding that data may now have lapsed, which means they may need to delete it. And you're also required to tell individuals that those third parties still have that data. Okay? This one should go without saying, but as we've all seen from the regular data breaches, it's not the case. But they're talking about all personal data. They're not just talking about secure passwords here. They don't make a distinction in the guidance. It just says personal data. So technically that means names, addresses, and things like that as well. And it's not enough to just jump through all those hoops to comply. You also actually have to keep evidence that you've been complying over time as part of your compliance. So those are the obligations on organizations. Hopefully it's just a refresher for you all. But we'll see. Now, individuals. We all have rights now, which we didn't have before. And they're typically broken down into 8 areas. I'm going to, again, run you through all of these. When someone wants to collect your personal data, they're supposed to provide you with something that is known as privacy information. That is a defined term in the guidance. It's more than just a privacy policy. So you'll want to go, if you're not familiar with that, you want to go to look at the ICO's website to see everything that's involved with that. If you get someone's personal data from a third party, maybe you're processing it on their behalf, or maybe you've bought a data set, for example, for direct marketing, which is a thing. Okay? You're supposed to contact everybody whose data you now have and provide them with your privacy information, because your privacy information may be different to whoever they originally gave the data to. But there is an asterisk there. One thing about GDPR is all these strong black and white statements often have caveats to them and only apply under certain circumstances. And this one in particular is so watered down. I'm personally curious to see whether this is ever enforceable in practice. We may find it's not. There's a thing now that's known as a subject access request. You can ask an organization to tell you what personal data they have on you. And they've got a month to comply. They've got a month to provide that. How many of you are confident that right now, if you hold personal data, that you could give them all that data within a month? Yeah, it's challenging if you haven't built for it. And when you're actually fulfilling a subject access request, you've got to make sure you don't leak anyone else's personal information into the bargain. You're not allowed to do that. And as we've seen with recent CPU bugs, like Spectre and things like that, the interaction of data can be mind-blowingly complex, and you can end up leaking things that you never intended to. So this one could be quite challenging in the long term. Someone can ask you, you can issue what's called a rectification request and say, you've got factually incorrect data on me, you need to repair it. And you've got a month to put that right. Okay? So this is the flip side of some of the obligations we've seen earlier on. You can issue an erasure request and say, I no longer want you to hold that data. And if, for example, the only reason you've got that data is consent, that means your lawful basis may have lapsed, and therefore you've got to delete it. And again, you've got a month to do that. Now, you may have heard that described as the right to be forgotten. There's a bit more to it than that. If the personal data is about a child, or someone's childhood, someone who's now an adult, the right to be forgotten has extra obligations that you'll need to go to the ICO website to learn more about. You can't treat everyone the same. This is something that I only came across when doing the research for this talk. This was something I wasn't aware of. If someone's disputing the factual accuracy of data, they have the right to issue what's called a processing restriction request. So you don't have to delete it, but you're not allowed to use it whilst you've got it. And the ICO website's got some suggestions about how you might go around implementing that. But I'd never heard of that one before, doing the research for this talk. Has anyone else come across that? No. That one's certainly got implications for event sourcing. There's a concept of data portability. You're supposed to be able to take your data and take it somewhere else. But again, one of those pesky asterisks. This one only applies under very specific circumstances and only if the data is already held in a computer system. So if the data is on paperwork, for example, you don't have the right to data portability because the data is not already in a computer. The right to object has been the headline that people have talked about since GDPR came along. But we're going to put that in a separate section because it throws up something that you may need to know about. This is one of my favorite rights. Anyone phoned up an insurance company who drives a car and you've been given a quote, and when you challenge the value of that quote, the cost of it, they say, well, that's what the computer says. Yeah? Anyone had that? I am hoping that GDPR says that's no longer an acceptable answer. Because insurance affects your legal ability to drive a car. Okay? You're not allowed to drive a car without that. And solely automated decision making, you can no longer just say that's the output, the algorithm. You've got to be able to explain how you got that result now under GDPR. We have the right to challenge that. We've also got the right to ask a human to double check that. To replace the computer's working out with someone else's working out. And to challenge those results. So this is about correcting data again of a form, but not personal data. It's about correcting the results of an automation that may already be stored in a database. And this is another one of my favorites. If the work you do falls under what's called solely automated decisions, and that's a defined term which has a lot of defined scope around it, doesn't apply to all computer operations. But if your work falls under that, you've actually got to be testing it on a regular basis. So GDPR may have actually made testing mandatory for some of us, legally required for the very first time. I don't know if you were aware of that. Nope. Now, I said about the right to object, and I wanted to break that out separately. The thing is with GDPR is a lot of these black and white statements, when you go and look at the detail of the advice, there's a lot more to it that you need to know and understand. And they're commonly called exemptions. And I came across them while researching the right to object because it's probably one of the biggest areas of the ICO guide. And there's the link to it if you want to go away and read this for yourself. See, the thing is, the statement I made earlier about personal data, covering the personal data, not all of it. Not all personal data is personal data according to GDPR. There's what's known as our exemptions. And these exemptions aren't defined in GDPR. They're actually defined in the Data Protection Act, which I haven't seen people talk about. But the ICO website says it in black and white. That's where you go and find them. Unfortunately, you don't have to go into the legislation. They've got a section all on exemptions for you, which you'll want to go and read. There's far too much there to keep in your head. Now here's the rub of it. That exemption list is only the UK's. There's 27 other members of the EU. They've got their own list under their own national legislation. So if you're handling personal data of people from any other EU country, you may need to go and find the list for their country and make sure you're complying with that as well. I don't know if many of you are aware of that. I certainly wasn't until I was researching this talk. It's not something I've seen people really talk about. Now, one of the reasons I've given you a general overview of GDPR rather than just pick stuff out that applies to event sourcing is I'm trying to show you what it's like to work in a regulatory environment. Regulations are complex. I've worked in telecoms. My wife's worked in finance. Everything we had to do had to go through a compliance team who were trained, and many of them often had legal qualifications, to sit down and interpret this stuff for us and tell us whether what we wanted to do was legal or not, whether it met the regulatory framework. You need to get that sort of advice. So, we've looked at event sourcing, we've looked at GDPR, and I've introduced you, by the sounds of it, to the Data Protection Act of 2018, all things you need to be aware of. Which leads us to the whole point of this talk. What do you think happens when the immutability of event sourcing meets these regulations? And what I want you to do is I want you to hold that question in your mind. I'm going to ask you to answer it in a moment. I'm going to give you some help first of all. And what I want to do with that, I want to break this down into some capabilities for software systems that you'll need to be able to implement. If you were to, well, hopefully you've all actually done GDPR compliance exercises in your firms, or you've been on the receiving end of one maybe, depending on what you do for a living. Can you give me some examples of the high-level requirements you've got to build into your software? Anybody? Ability to scrub data, yep. Anyone else? Real high-level stuff. Allow customers to opt in, okay. Any more? Exporting for subject access requests, okay. Well, I'm going to take you through the list I've compiled for this talk. Now, one thing I want to make plain is this list is talking about the capabilities your software needs. I'm not talking about when those capabilities need to be triggered, what you would call policy, if you like. I've deliberately separated that out because I don't know what personal data your organizations hold, and I don't know the circumstances when these capabilities need to be triggered. That's what your legal advice is for. And I'm not for a moment claiming that this list is exhaustive. The other thing you need to be aware of, those of you who've worked in regulated industries, you're well aware of the effect enforcement has over the regulations over time, how it provides clarity and often shapes and changes the regulations. Regulators regulate, legislators legislate. It's what they do. So even if this list was comprehensive today, it will go out of date. So when you're looking at all of these for your software, you need to be looking at these from the most flexible point of view possible. You cannot get away with taking this stuff and narrowing it down and trying to de-scope it as much as possible to make it as small a headache as possible. All you're doing is kicking the can down the road. And the less said about kicking cans right now, the better, hopefully. So the first requirement, all personal data must be stored securely. You've got to be able to identify the lawful purpose for each piece of data you've got, something your system needs to be able to do. And you've got to be able to do that for every single piece of processing you do with it. Now that has an implication. You may need to actually keep track of what pieces of data you fed into what algorithms, potentially. The ICO website does not cover this one way or the other, but that may be a consequence of the GDPR regulations. We mentioned about being able to get data for subject access requests. You must be able to retrieve all the data about any individual. You've got to be able to update it as well. And this is a good example where you're better off treating all data as something you want to update rather than just small amounts of it. Because the definition of personal data will vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, depending on where the person's from. And it will change in future. You need to be flexible on this. Mentioned about scrubbing. You've got to be able to get rid of the data as if you never had it in the first place. And again, that reminder that it explicitly covers backups and archives as well. If you've got personal data, but it's subject to a processing restriction request, you've got to make sure you're not using that data. Now, it's meant to be a temporary state of affairs while the dispute over the accuracy of the data is sorted. It's not meant to be a long-term thing, but you've still got to be able to do it. If you're handling stuff that falls under the definition of solely automated decisions, you've got to have a mechanism to be able to review it. And again, that implies that you need to know what data has been fed into that decision-making process, because you can't review it if you can't say what the inputs are. So there's a strong implication there. And you need the ability to override those algorithms if necessary, if you fall under that particular part of GDPR. Now, so far, none of these are unique to event sourcing. I'm not pretending that they are. I think it's important you've got a good overall view of GDPR before we dive into the details. When it comes to event sourcing, those systems present unique challenges. And now we're back to the question about immutability. So what do you think happens? How event sourcing might actually be able to comply with GDPR from what you've heard so far? Anyone want to have a guess? Okay. The answer from everyone in the room is the same as you'll find online. If you go looking at frameworks, you'll find most of them haven't written a single thing about GDPR compliance. Okay? You're not alone by any means. And the reason for that is it all comes down to what makes event sourcing unique. State, and the way states handle. The problem really is state. We all work on traditional systems. So we have met many of these requirements by being able to edit state. That's how we solve many of the GDPR requirements, including the ones we've picked out. There's no state in the primary data store of an event sourcing system. You've got events, state is calculated. There's a process of playback. So there's no state to edit. You've got to recalculate. And just a reminder, it's the events that hold the personal data. That's your primary data store. It's the events you're focused on. Now, those of us who've worked on systems that have lived for years, you know how complicated even what seemingly simple things can get. If you've got events all being fed into these calculators in order to produce current state, that interaction can be complex. It can exceed the ability to keep it in your head, and it can exceed the ability to accurately work it out on a whiteboard or a piece of paper. That can be a problem. And once again, a reminder of where this personal data ends up. Primary data store is the event store, but it can also end up in the projection cache, and it can also end up in snapshots if you're using CQRS with event sourcing. So what I'm going to do now is we're going to go back over the GDPR requirements yet again, but just focusing on those that are specific to ES-CQRS and the challenges. I'm not going to tell you how to solve them, but I'm going to ask you some questions for you to take away if you're thinking of adopting event sourcing yourself. So, here. You don't see a lot of people talk about this one, about storing all data securely. Event stores can be specialist. Yeah, they may not be a traditional database with usernames and passwords. So if you're thinking of adopting event sourcing, you need to look at how the event store actually protects data. You can't say the system as a whole protects data. Every level of your architecture has to have its own safeguards in place, or you're potentially liable. Mention that there's the protection cache and snapshots. If the protection cache is something like memcache, is that secure? For example, have you set it up in a secure way? How do you meet the requirement for that? Something to think of. Being able to update any piece of personal data. This is the one people talk about online. If your event store is an append-only system, you cannot actually change the data in it. How do you correct that data? Anyone want to have a guess? You append more data. Okay? It's the only mechanism available to you. But if you're appending more data, that means you've actually still got the incorrect data as well. Remember what we said earlier about event stores being able to play back state for any point in time? If you're holding the incorrect data, that means you're potentially at risk of reusing that incorrect data to produce incorrect results. So are you meeting the requirement in those circumstances, the GDPR requirement? I don't see people talking about that. We've mentioned data scrubbing. Soft deletes will not do. It's got to be hard deletes. You've got to be able to get rid of it as if you never ever had it. If your event store is immutable, how do you delete data from that if you can't change it? How do you find the personal data that's in the projection cache and the snapshots in order to get rid of it? The mechanism for updating the projection cache is to rebuild it. That's how you do it. You drop it and you rebuild it. And then you've got to save more snapshots. But if you're rebuilding it, you may be using code that's changed over the last year or 2 years. So if I've come to you and I've said, delete my data, and you've been forced to do so, and then you rebuild your projection cache, can you guarantee you're not rebuilding anyone else's personal data at the same time? Can you guarantee that? Are you actually breaking other people's data and therefore breaking GDPR? Now coming back to the event store for the moment, I did see one neat trick someone had come up with for event stores. And that the idea of actually the personal data, making sure it's ring-fenced in records that are encrypted. And their idea of deleting it is to put it beyond use by losing the encryption keys for that data so you can't retrieve it. Question is though, does it actually put it beyond use forever? Is it possible for future technology to come along where the encryption can be cracked? Quantum computing, for example. Is that a risk factor? Does it mean you can't comply with the regulations if you do that trick? And once again, I just want to remind you, when you're scrubbing data, you've got to get rid of it from your backups and your archives as well. You can't hang on to it. I'm sorry if I'm ramming that down people's throats. It's something you really need to remember. Being able to avoid processing personal data while the accuracy of it is being disputed. If you're rebuilding state, how do you, and you're skipping over data, what's the implications of that? What's the impact of that? Are you just affecting that user's data? Are you affecting other people's data? Because if you're doing a projection rebuild and you've got this complex interaction of events, can you guarantee you're not affecting anyone else's personal data in a negative way? Have you designed your system for that? I mentioned this implication that comes up a couple of times when looking at GDPR, about you may need to actually know what pieces of data you fed into an algorithm. Now, traditionally, we do that by pulling backups and replaying back on a test system. That's how we've done it historically. But you haven't got that backup to work with. You haven't got that state. So if that implication is true for your organization, when you're using event sourcing, can you reproduce that state with 100% accuracy for that point in time? Can you do it? Chances are you can't. So does that mean when you're actually performing processing, you've actually got to archive the state you fed into those projections, sorry, not projections, the state you fed into the processing at that time in order to be able for users to challenge, to challenge those decisions. And these questions add up to one question above all else. Is it possible to have the benefits of event sourcing? That guarantee of being able, you've built a time machine that works on your data. Is it possible to do that and achieve GDPR compliance? What is it going to cost? And is it worth the hassle? And only you, if you're looking at doing event sourcing, can answer that. I can't answer that for you. So what I'm trying to do here is I'm not trying to say you shouldn't use event sourcing. What I'm trying to do is make sure if you're ever looking at event sourcing, you're going into it with a set of questions so you can make an informed decision of your own. That's what I'm trying to do. And to help with that, I just want to sum up by throwing some more things at you. GDPR is not something you bolt on. To comply with it completely, it's foundational. It affects your business, and your IT systems affect those businesses and organizations. It's regulation. You need to be getting proper advice on this stuff. Now, when it comes to enforcement, we're at a very early stage of it. When I was researching this talk, I went onto the ICO website to see how enforcement was going on. It wasn't possible for me to easily see what enforcement has taken place. If memory serves, I was left with the impression the ICO website is mostly chasing people who send unsolicited texts and messages and things like that, and robocallers, rather than this. So we don't yet know what GDPR enforcement will look like. We don't know how hard the hammer will fall. We just don't know. But we can look at other regulated industries where we know that how regulations are enforced and how they're not enforced does shape the future advice. We can see that in other industries. Anyone who's worked in telecoms or finance will be well aware of that. Now, from my point of view, based on my research for this talk, I can't see how you can have an immutable system that complies with GDPR. I don't think it's even up for debate. I don't see how you can do that. I think they're fundamentally incompatible. But it's up to you to make your own mind up. If I had a CTO hat on right now, there is no way I would adopt anything that relies on immutability if I'm handling personal data. Wouldn't take the risk. That's me personally. Not a chance. But if you are going to adopt it, as well as all those questions we've got before, there are some more that you might want to ask. If you're picking an event sourcing framework, where is its documentation on how you can use it in a way to be GDPR compliant? Why hasn't the framework documented this? If they haven't documented it, chances are they've not thought of it. So you need to be aware of that. Yeah. If they have got documentation, who signed that off? When we look at security software, we look for security audits, don't we? We look for firms to say, yes, we've done an audit of this code, we believe it's secure. Where's the equivalent for any advice on GDPR that are given out by frameworks? Where is that? Make sure you ask that question. Because if the advice is just from the developers, that device is not qualified. And in a regulated environment, you shouldn't be using unqualified advice. You may be attending an event sourcing workshop at some point. And if you do, ask the same question to the person leading the workshop. They are probably experienced and they probably have answers to help you with this stuff. Okay? But again, any advice they are giving needs to have been signed off by someone who's qualified to judge it because you're working in a regulatory environment. So where is their advice signed off by? Because at the end of the day, it's you who are doing the data processing or acting as the data controller who are legally liable. It's not the framework, it's not the consultant who's running the workshop. It's you because you're handling the data. So you need to take steps to make sure that you are compliant. What do you think? Have I put anyone off event sourcing for life, first of all? A few hands gone up there and a few nodding smiles. Have I said anything tonight that you think fundamentally needs challenging, first of all? Nope. I appreciate it's a lot to absorb. The slides will be up online when I get back to the hotel room tonight. Did you realize it was a topic quite of this scope? Nope. Okay. Now, fortunately, as developers, we don't seem to have individual liability. The liability seems to be on organizations. That's my personal understanding. But again, not a lawyer, could be wrong. But GDPR does change the world, and there's going to be more of it. There is more privacy legislation coming down the pipeline. This is not the end of it by any means. So it's good to get your head around this stuff. And the best way to do it, I find, is to work out what the right questions are for you and your organization. That's better than a cookie. Sorry, I'm tired. It's better than a cookie cutter answer. Is actually work out the questions that apply, like I've done tonight with this talk. There will be other questions I've not thought of, because I've not implemented event sourcing in a GDPR environment, and I personally wouldn't. Doesn't mean it can't be done. I'm not here saying it can't be done, but it's got a lot of challenges that are different than if you're working on a traditional system. So any questions to finish? Nope. Stunned silence. Well, if you do think of any questions, you can always reach out to me on Twitter, and I'll do my best to answer them. And again, if any of you end up doing your own research and you find additional questions, or you find that some of this doesn't stand up to scrutiny when you're doing your own research, I'd love to hear from it as well. I think as a community, the more we pull what we find about this, even when we don't disagree, I think the more we pull it, the better we all are for it, the better off we all are. Okay. Well, in that case, thank you very much.